everyone. This is your reading for chapter 13 of Hatchet. I have my questions in front of me. For number 1, we're going to be looking for what did Brian see when he was looking for the foolish birds and how did he react? Brian stood at the end of the long part of the L of the lake and watched the water, smelled the water, listened to the water, was the water. A fish moved and his eyes jerked sideways to see the ripples, but he did not move any other part of his body and did not raise the bow or reach into his belt pouch for a fish arrow. It was not the right kind of fish, not a food fish. The food fish stayed close in the shallows and did not roll that way, but made quicker movements, food movements. The large fish rolled and stayed deep and could not be taken. But it didn't matter. This morning, he was not looking for fish. Fish was light meat, and he was sick of them. Okay, let's pause for just a minute because in the last chapter, we saw him trying to get fish, and he couldn't get any. We haven't seen him eat one fish at all. We saw him trying to get a fish, and then he heard a plane, and he missed the plane. Remember that? And he was in a low, depressed, hopeless state. And so now we see him, it's almost like we see somebody different, right? He's watching the water, he's smelling the water, he is the water. He's somehow changing. He recognizes all the different kinds of fish. And he says, that's not what I want. And he was tired of fish. So what can we assume has happened between the end of 12 and the beginning of 13? Time has passed, right? There's been some time passed, and the author is letting you know that in a unique way. And then he's going to go back and fill in the missing part. So don't get confused. Don't say, oh, wait a minute. He's doing it because he knows you're smart. He knows you can figure out what he's doing as he's telling you in a smart way, not a, and then 2 months went by, okay? He's telling you in a way that your brain is slowly coming to realize what's happening. Okay, so let's continue. He was looking for one of the foolish birds. He called them fool birds, and there was a flock that lived near the end of the long part of the lake. But something he did not understand had stopped him, and he stood, breathing gently through his mouth to keep silent, letting his eyes and ears go out and do the work for him. It had happened before this way. Something had come into him from outside to warn him, and he had stopped. Once it had been the bear again. He had been taking the last of the raspberries, and something came inside and stopped him. And when he looked where his ears said to look, there was a female bear with cubs. He had taken 2 more steps. Had he taken 2 more steps, he would have come between the mother and her cubs, and that was a bad place to be. As it was, the mother had stood and faced him and made a sound, a low sound in her throat to threaten and warn him. He paid attention to the feeling now, and he stood and waited patiently, knowing he was right and that something would come. Turn, smell, listen, feel, and then a sound, a small sound, and he looked up and away from the lake and saw the wolf. It was halfway up the hill from the lake, standing with its head and shoulders sticking out into a small opening, looking down on him with wide yellow eyes. He had never seen a wolf, and the size threw him, not as big as a bear, but somehow seeming that large. Threw him means that it kind of surprised him, right? The wolf claimed all that was below him as his own, took Brian as his own. Brian looked back and for a moment felt afraid because the wolf was so right. He felt Brian, knew him and owned him and chose not to do anything to him. But the fear moved away, and Brian knew the wolf for what it was, another part of the woods, another part of all of it. Brian relaxed the tension on the spear in his hand, settled the bow in his other hand from where it had started to come up. He knew the wolf now as the wolf knew him, and he nodded to it. nodded and smiled. The wolf watched him for another time, another part of his life. Then it turned and walked effortlessly up the hill, and as it came out of the brush, it was followed by 3 other wolves, all equally large and gray and beautiful, all looking down on him as they trotted past and away, and Brian nodded to each of them. Okay, so that was your answer to number 1. What did he see and how did he react? So you see that he saw the wolves, and how did he react to them? He didn't start shooting, he didn't start running. At first he was a little afraid, but then he just kind of nodded. He realized that they were part of the woods as now he was part of the woods. He was not the same now. The Brian that stood and watched the wolves move away and nodded to them was completely changed. Time had come, time that he measured but didn't care about. Time had come into his life and moved out and left him different. In measured time, 47 days had passed since the crash. Okay, so there's your number 2. 42 days, he thought, since he had died and been born as the new Brian. When the plane had come and gone, it had put him down, gutted him, and dropped him and left him with nothing. The rest of that first day, he had gone down and down until dark. He had let the fire go out, had forgotten to even eat an egg, had let his brain take him down to where he was done, where he wanted to be done and done. So now he's telling you what happened when that plane flew over. He's going back in time, and that was only about, just a few days after the crash. But it's been a long time, more than a month, like a month and a half since then. But he's telling you what happened that time. He got so depressed, he got so down. And now it says, to where he wanted to die. He had settled into the gray funk deeper and still deeper until finally in the dark, he had gone up on the ridge and taken the hatchet and tried to end it by cutting himself. Madness. A hissing madness that took his brain. There had been nothing for him then, and he tried to become nothing. But the cutting had been hard to do, impossible to do, and he had at last fallen to his side, wishing for death, wishing for an end, and slept, only didn't sleep. With his eyes closed and his mind open, he lay on the rock through the night, lay and hated and wished for it to end, and thought the word cloud down, through the awful night. Over and over the word, wanting all his clouds to come down. But in the morning he was still there on his side, and the sun came up, and when he opened his eyes he saw the cuts on his arm, the dry blood turning black. He saw the blood and hated the blood. Hated what he had done to himself when he was the old Brian and was weak. And 2 things came into his mind. 2 true things. He was not the same. The plane passing changed him. The disappointment cut him down and made him new. He was not the same and would never be again like he had been. That was one of the true things, the new things. And the other one was that he would not die. He would not let death in again. He was new. Okay, so on number 3, you're going to describe what happened in his mind, what he felt when the plane flew over. How he got depressed, right? He even wanted to just end it all, just die. So that's kind of what happened to him. But then he woke up and he realized something changed. He realized, okay, so they're not coming for me, but I am not going to die. I'm going to survive. He had a change in his mind. Okay, middle of the page. Of course, he had made a lot of mistakes. He smiled now, walking up the lakeshore after the wolves were gone, thinking of the early mistakes. The mistakes that came before he realized that he had to find new ways to be what he had become. He had made a new fire, which he now kept going using partially rotten wood because the punky wood would smolder for many hours and still come back with fire. But that had been the extent of doing things right for a while. His first bow was a disaster that almost blinded him. He had sat a whole night and shaped the limbs carefully until the bow looked beautiful. Then he spent 2 days making arrows. The shafts were willow, straight and with the bark peeled, and he fire hardened the points and split a couple of them to make fork points, as he had done with the spear. He had no feathers, so he just left them bare, figuring for fish they only had to travel a few inches. He had no string, and that threw him until he looked down at his tennis shoes. They had long laces, too long, and he found that one lace cut in half would take care of both shoes, and that left the other lace for a bowstring. All seemed to be going well until he tried a test shot. He put an arrow to the string, pulled it back to his cheek, pointed it at a dirt hummock, and at that precise instant the bow wood exploded in his hands, sending splinters and chips of wood into his face. Two pieces actually stuck into his forehead, just above his eyes, and had they been only slightly lower, they would have blinded him. Too stiff. Mistakes. In his mental journal, he listed them to tell his father, listed all of the mistakes. He had made a new bow with slender limbs and a more fluid, gentle pull, but could not hit the fish, though he sat in the water and was in the end surrounded by a virtual cloud of small fish. It was infuriating. He would pull the bow back, set the arrow just above the water, and when the fish was no more than an inch away, release the arrow, only to miss. It seemed to him that the arrow had gone right through the fish, again and again. But the fish didn't get hurt. Finally, after hours, he stuck the arrow down in the water, pulled the bow, and waited for a fish to come close. And while he was waiting, he noticed that the water seemed to make the arrow bend or break in the middle. Of course, he had forgotten that water refracts, bends light. He had learned that somewhere, in some class. Maybe it was biology, he couldn't remember. But it did bend light. And that meant the fish were not where they appeared to be. They were lower, just below, which meant he had to aim just under them. He would not forget his first hit. Not ever. A round-shaped fish with gold insides, sides as gold as the sun, stopped in front of the arrow, and he aimed just beneath it at the bottom edge of the fish and released the arrow, and there was a bright flurry, a splash of gold in the water. He grabbed the arrow and raised it up, and the fish was on the end, wiggling against the blue sky. He held the fish against the sky until it stopped wiggling, held it and looked to the sky and felt his throat tighten, swell, and fill with pride at what he had done. He had done food. With his bow, with an arrow fashioned by his own hands, he had done food, had found a way to live. The bow had given him this way, and he exulted in it, in the bow, in the arrow, in the fish, in the hatchet, in the sky. He stood and walked from the water, still holding the fish and arrow and bow against the sky, seeing them as they fit his arms, as they were part of him. He had food. Think of the pride. Have you ever done something and you've been so proud of it because it had been something you really learned all on your own? That's how he feels. He has done this. He has done this thing so seemingly impossible. He has taught himself. He has taken his mistakes. He has learned from them. I mean, this is when you really learn from mistakes, right? When you are forced to. If he chooses to give up now, he dies. So now there is no giving up. His mind has completely changed. He will use whatever he needs to use to survive. And that gives you a true growth mindset, right? No giving up is even an option. He's new. He's changed. This is still in the past, though. This is still telling you about when he first caught the fish. And from the beginning of the chapter, we know he's done with fish, right? He's tired of them. He cut a green willow fork and held the fish over the fire until the skin crackled and peeled away, and the meat inside was flaky and moist and tender. This he picked off carefully with his fingers, tasting every piece, mashing them in his mouth with his tongue to get the juices out of them. Hot, steaming pieces of fish. He could not, he thought then, ever get enough. And all that first new day, he spent going to the lake, shooting a fish, taking it back to the fire, cooking it and eating it, and on that way until it was dark. He had taken the scraps back to the water with the thought that they might work for bait, and the other fish came by the hundreds to clean them up. He could take his pick of them, like a store, he thought, just like a store. And he could not remember later how many he ate that day, but he thought it must have been over 20. It had been a feast day, his first feast day, and a celebration of being alive and the new way he had of getting food. By the end of that day, when it became dark and he lay next to the fire with his stomach full of fish and grease from the meat smeared around his mouth, he could feel new hope building in him. Not hope that he would be rescued. That was gone. But hope in his knowledge. Hope in the fact that he could learn and survive and take care of himself. Tough hope, he thought that night. I am full of tough hope. I love this. So this is question 4. It says he had been filled with a new hope. What was that hope based on? So this is what he calls tough hope. It's not hope that, oh, I wish, oh, someone's going to rescue me, oh, I hope someone's going to come soon. This is hope based on what he knows. He knows now that he has the ability in himself. Remember Mr. Perpich telling him his greatest asset was himself? So he knows now he has hope based on knowledge. He doesn't have hope that one day everything's just going to instantly get better. He knows that from now on it's going to be hard, but he knows that he has the ability to survive. And this is a little bit like our Christian hope. We're not hoping and praying that one day everything will be okay, but not really sure, and I just hope. It's not a hope based on I wonder or I wish. It's a hope based on I know. It is a faith-based hope. I know that I have a Savior that has rescued me. I know He has made all things right. And in the meantime, I have to live this tough life. I have to live this hard life. I have to keep walking. Remember in Hebrews? It was the race. You have to run the race with confidence, looking to your Savior. That in itself is a tough hope. We have hope knowing we are assured to see a Savior. We are assured that we will be home with our God one day. But this life is not easy. You're going to have to survive. You're going to have to depend on God to lead you through it. It's a tough hope. What a beautiful, beautiful picture to see His journey and His life as kind of our struggle to trust in Jesus. Now, He is trusting in Himself and His abilities. Ours is something a little bit different. So, in one sentence, write the main idea of this chapter. This is the changing point. This is your, oh man, look at what he's doing. Look at what he's learning. This is the changing point in the book. This is the exciting chapter for me. I love to read this chapter and see what he has learned and how he is changing. And now it's almost like we don't see this kind of depressed kid. We see this person surviving and really surviving. Okay, I look forward to reading the next chapter with you. Go ahead and in the comments, tell me one more thing you still think he's going to encounter. I know we did this a few times ago, but I want you to say, well, I still think he's going to do this. He's seen a wolf. He's seen his bear again. He's got fish. Okay, what do you think is still something that he's going to face? Okay, I can't wait to the next one.